This is the October 10th, 2011 Littleton City Planning Commission meeting. It's a regular meeting. So can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Bagnall.
Here.
Commissioner Bockenstead.
Here.
Commissioner Coronado.
He's walking in.
Commissioner Elrod.
Here.
Commissioner Gallagher. Commissioner Newfinke.
Here.
Commissioner Metcalf.
Here.
Commissioner Ranville.
Here.
Commissioner Samuelson.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Okay. Do we have any changes to the agenda? I have one to add after adjournment that will adjourn to a special meeting to address the downtown area plan. Any objections? None? Seeing none. Any other changes to the agenda? Seeing none, let's move to the approval of the minutes. The September 22nd, 2011 special meeting minutes. Any changes?
I have one for each. And actually, this is more, at least on the minutes of the 22nd, more a question or a request. On page 3, after the listing of all the individual comment summaries, would it be possible, advisable, acceptable, you select the word, if we added a note that more complete summaries of the comments received have been recorded someplace, on the website, in the community development records, something or other, and are hereby incorporated by reference? I mean, we do have more extensive notes on those comments that I think should be in the record.
One thing we do have as far as a permanent record is the Granicus video. Now, I think these are comments that were actually written down on cards. Is that correct?
It's a combination.
So we do keep those cards.
Right.
Yeah, Dennis has all that.
Yeah, so we could put a reference that we do have the actual written documentation.
But we also produced a matrix, a printed list of more extensive definition of those comments that's available. Wouldn't take any additional staff work. It's already there.
Dennis has it.
I'd just like to get those incorporated by reference, if that's acceptable to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that's acceptable to everybody. So we'll include a reference to the completed comments from the public sessions. Okay, any other changes? All right, should we go ahead and vote?
On the 20, sorry, I thought that was
on the
somebody
22nd.
else's comments on the meeting minutes of the 22nd. On the 26th, talking about the proposed code revision that we're going to reconsider tonight. Essentially, the discussion, starting with line 40 on page 2, says that the commissioners expressed concerns that the code lacks specific definitions for fine arts and martial arts. Well, that wasn't the only significant objection raised that night. The other objection was concern that such additional uses could significantly add to traffic through surrounding residential neighborhoods. I'd like to see that added in there. It was more than just definition of fine arts and martial arts.
What do you guys think?
That was my recollection as well.
I heard.
Yeah. And any other comments? So are we ready to vote on both minutes? Okay, all those in favor of both minutes? And that is everybody in favor. Then we have scheduled and unscheduled appearances. Is anybody here who wishes to speak to any subject that they would like? Kristen?
Didn't we close the public hearing?
We closed the public hearing.
Okay, so if the public hearing's closed, then that portion of it would be closed, so you could have them speak right now and unscheduled public appearances if you want to do that.
Okay. If you would like to talk about the ordinance, please come and speak now for, during the unscheduled public appearances, because we closed the public hearing.
My name is Andrew Benedict, and I'm the owner of the property that they were talking about specifically. But specifically, when I talked to Bruce Stallman about the Taekwondo studio that was part of the change that was being made, one of the things that he said was that this is not something we want to do on a one-time basis. There are other buildings that could be affected, other churches that may go out of business, because this was originally what that building was constructed for, and other facilities that may be incorporated in that. And with that in mind, it was a matter of how that would affect the whole city in general. And there's one specific example that I can think of that applies that is really not, that I'm aware of, that is not even being considered, and that is the building that Western Welcome Week is in. As I understand it, Western Welcome Week is not a city function, but rather is a separate 501c3, and it's located in a building right on the park, right next to the area that we're talking about, and it's in a residential home. So it's a subject that's going to affect not only the building that I own, but also other buildings that potentially may be owned by other people in the future. And the other thing is just if anybody had any specific questions of me or concerns that we were out of town when the last meeting was. We had scheduled a vacation months ahead of time, and so weren't here.
Can you also state your address for the record?
My address is 5905 South Crocker Street in Littleton. I'm also on Stearns Park, my home is.
Okay, any questions? Seeing none. Anybody else wish to speak? Thank you very much.
My name is Joseph Devlin. I live at 5870 South Bemis Street, Littleton, right next to Stern Park, directly across from the Rose Garden. I wish to state that the Martial Art Academy is a fine neighbor and a fine school to have in the area. There's no problem, no disruption. We hardly know that they're even there. They keep the sidewalks shoveled in the winter. The only traffic that we have are light rail traffic, which comes all the way down Bemis right up to our house. But other than that, we don't even know that there's any activity in the building. They're a fine neighbor, and I think anything should be. I think that it should be approved for that academy in the area. If there's any questions, I'll try to answer.
Any questions? Thank you very much. Any other people wishing to speak? Seeing none, we'll move to our general business, which is a continuation of the discussion regarding the ordinance amending City Code sections 10-3-2 and 10-8-2 relating to non-residential uses in the R3, the R3X, the R4, and R5 zone districts. And this is a continuation from our September 26, 2011 meeting.
Linda, I need to state that I need to recuse myself from this discussion because I'm related to one of the owners of that business.
Okay, thank you.
And at this time, I need to bring up that I did miss that meeting. However, I did watch the video of the meeting, and I am up to date with what happened with that meeting, so I can proceed.
Okay, thank you.
As if I was there.
So Jan is going to give us a brief summary.
Good evening, Commission. I did do a little research and prepared a definition for fine arts and a specific definition for martial arts, and I've included those in your staff report. Defining fine arts as an art form developed primarily for aesthetics and/or concept rather than practical application. The fine arts commonly include the visual art and performing art forms such as painting, sculpture, collage assemblage, calligraphy, music, dance, theater, photography, and printmaking. And the definition for martial arts proposed is various forms of self-defense, usually weaponless, based on techniques developed in ancient China, India, and Tibet. For purposes of this definition, martial arts shall include only the traditional forms such as jiu-jitsu, kung fu, karate, taekwondo, and judo. There was some concern expressed at the last meeting regarding mixed martial arts and extreme fighting competitions, and I did want to just clarify that the new use category proposed specifically says studios for teaching fine arts and martial arts. It does not propose this use as an entertainment. In this category, our zoning code allows recreation, amusements, entertainment uses in the commercial zone district. So this is just specifically for teaching purposes. And I did take the ordinance that you looked at last time and revised it to include these definitions as part of that ordinance. So, Steve?
So would this conditional use not allow any competitions?
Correct. It would be for teaching.
Okay, even though it would be a like a teaching dojo, it would still, it would not allow competitions like on, a couple times a year or anything, even though the main use would be to teach the martial arts?
It would just be teaching. I mean, if they were going to do a competition or something, then they would have to probably find space, elsewhere, like, and maybe rent, lease a space, or I don't know, in a shopping center or something like that. But if we allowed competition, then you'd be getting possibly, some students from some other facility over here, and that would definitely cause the traffic issue. So that the purpose for this, the intent for this is just to be for teaching, and that would hopefully mitigate the traffic impacts if it's just exclusive to just the teaching instead of holding competitions on the weekend or something like that,
Can I interrupt 1 second? I just want to remind everybody to turn off their cell phones, and even if they have it on vibrate, it will still interfere with the system sound, the room sound system. So thank you. Sorry, Jan.
Okay, it's in the car.
Okay, so this would be for exclusive teaching.
Correct. And I also just want to point out, too, again, Steve wasn't at the meeting last week. The proposal in the R3, the single-family zone districts, R3, R3X, and R4, is that these studios would be conditional uses. That means if this ordinance did get passed, the gentleman here tonight would have to come back through the city with an application for conditional use and come back before you all officially in a public hearing for his specific studio that he has, and he could address specifics with his operation with you then, and you can also apply specific conditions to his approval in order to address any kind of mitigation concerns you might have in the neighborhood. That's the purpose of a conditional use.
Okay,
So-
and as of this conditional use, we're the final say on this one?
Yes, you are.
It does not go to council?
No, it doesn't. In fact, no, it doesn't. The appeal process for a conditional use is district court. So it's your final decision on that.
But we would not have the final say on a permit, this as a permitted use in the R5 zones.
Correct.
Why did you leave it as a permitted use in the R5?
Well, when I was looking at it, the R5 zone actually does allow medical office use as a permitted use in the R5 for buildings that are 10,000 square feet or less. And I was trying to in my head thinking this because I didn't see this use as any more impacting than a medical office use. traffic-wise and, you know, in a commercial type of situation. So to me, it didn't make sense to actually make this a conditional use in the R5 when R5 is already allowed to have a commercial use of office in it. So that was my logic in that.
Even though they could have a class of 20 students showing up at one time?
Well, medical office is actually a more intense, traffic use than regular general office. I mean, just based on the parking calculations required for medical office versus regular office. So when the parking ratio for medical office is 1 space per 250 square feet of floor area, and you have not only at a medical office, you don't have the employees, but you have got the patient traffic too. And I honestly, trying to logically think about it, I don't think a facility like this gentleman's would have as much traffic impact as a medical office would, or a dentist office. So, or multifamily residential, you can have 45 units to the acre of density in R5 too. So I just comparing it just didn't seem to me that this type of use was even more as impacting as those two uses in the R5.
So with this being a conditional use, it can only be in the schools or in an old school or an old church?
It can be only, yeah, and that's the other restriction is a conditional use. It can only occur in an existing church or school. Somebody can't say, oh, I'm going to scrape this house off this lot and build this new building for a martial arts studio. They can't do that.
That's as a conditional use.
Right.
As a permitted use in R5, does it not need to be a school or a church there?
Yeah, so I didn't propose that because, once again, I felt that you're going to have multifamily apartment buildings in R5. You can have regular schools and churches in R5. You can have medical office buildings in R5. So I didn't see the difference impacting wise of having a martial arts studio or a fine arts studio built specifically in the R5 district when you have other, you have the multifamily, which is higher impacting, and then you have the other commercial use already that's allowed in R5.
So in an R5, it could be built. It could be put into any building in an R5.
Yeah, that's the proposal.
With it being a permitted use.
Yes. And I would point out though, it would require, since it's not single-family residential, the process for that is they would have to go through site development plan approval through the city. They can't just go pull a permit and put this in there. They can't just take a medical office building and convert it to this. They would have to go through the site plan approval process, which would require it to be evaluated too for parking and, traffic and those things.
Why as a planning commission would we not want it to be a conditional use in the R5?
That's up to you to decide. I mean, as staff, I was just recommending that it be a permitted use because I didn't see it as being any more impacting in the R5 district than multifamily residential or the medical office use that's a commercial use that's already allowed in R5. It didn't make sense to me to require this type of use to go through more scrutiny with impacts when it wouldn't be rendering any more impacts in that zone district than other uses that are already permitted in that district. So to me, the R5 district is a lot different than those single-family districts. Just, but.
Dave?
Even though we've been dealing with the R5 neighborhood downtown.
Well, you have R5 elsewhere in the city of
Yeah.
Littleton. So that's, I know you've got special concerns with the R5 downtown, and I know you're looking at addressing that in your downtown plan. And I know as a result of that, you may be implementing some other things through the zoning code eventually to address that sort of protection that you want to give to that specific area downtown. But I just, when I was doing this ordinance, I'm right now looking at all the R5 zone districts because there's other R5 in the city that does have medical office in it, that does have higher density apartment buildings in it, that isn't the character that you're looking at in the downtown area.
Where I'm getting at is we're looking at by doing it a permitted use in R5, the area in downtown that we've been trying to protect, that citizens have been telling us for years that they want us to keep it how it is, that we're allowing another use, if this were to pass, as a permitted use in that area. And instead of doing it as a conditional use.
You know, I don't know how to, you know, without implementing the comp plan that you're doing, I don't know how to, at this point, decipher between one part of town, R5, and another part of town, R5, when I'm looking at a code right now. I just, you know, I don't know if you have any suggestions.
Steve, can I suggest that we talk about this as a planning commission after we, after Jan finishes up her discussion?
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, because I believe you were, you know, looking at, you know, you had specific concerns about even medical office still in that area downtown. And so I just might want to address it in the comp plan instead. So.
Yeah, I had a question. As I was reviewing the current zoning regs for the for churches and institutions in residential neighborhoods, it appears that any other use on a church property besides the church itself is already considered a conditional use, the way it's described.
That's correct, a church facilities.
Right. Does that only matter if the church is functioning? Because otherwise, it's already a conditional use, correct?
Well, the church facility is supposed to be, you know, accessory to a primary church use. So, and in this case, you know, and I think there had been some of that activity occurring in the church at the time it was a church, and I think that's part of what's happened with the transition over time, that the church left there, and then I think, you know, that he was under the impression to go ahead and continue that use, and but the church not being there, that kind of rendered this, well, now this has become the principal use, and it really isn't under the current code permitted that way. But yeah, the church facility, that actually is an ordinance that came to be after I came here, and it was because we started getting inquiries for churches that had other uses like gymnasiums and you know, other meetings and other uses that weren't specifically just so church related. So that's why we identified a separate type of accessory use in a church facility, but felt that that can create some impacts on a neighborhood that a regular church wouldn't. So that's why that ordinance was created back then and put church facilities under conditional use. But it would have to be tied with a church use on the property.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that answers my question. Okay, thanks.
Other questions, Dave?
So, Jan, if this ordinance goes, this ordinance goes through, not only would these be permitted uses in any R5, but also any existing church or school in any neighborhood in the city could be converted to this use as a conditional use.
Not in any neighborhood in the city, only in the R3 and the R. And I'll tell you, the majority of the churches and schools, or public schools that are out there are in the R2 neighborhood. I looked, and I only found about 5, right now, what's existing out there, I only found about 5 or 6 churches and or schools, which are public schools actually, that are located in this zone district.
But currently the R3, R3X, and R4 have the same protection as the R1s and R2s. What we're saying with this is not anymore, essentially.
Pardon?
Okay. Right now, the R1, 2, 3, 3X, and 4 have the same protections against putting a commercial use within the neighborhood.
Right now, yes.
This would say R1s and R2s, you keep your protection. Everybody else, no. If somebody wants to convert a church or a school to a business use, generating business traffic, 24, whatever, throughout business hours, day in and day out, they're perfectly permitted to come before the DRC and the Planning Commission and ask permission to do so.
That's
We're
correct.
treating the other zones differently than the R1 and R2.
That's
Okay.
correct.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Jan. Do we have a motion on the table to start discussion?
So move.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved by Dave and seconded by Jenny to the suggested motion as provided in the packet. Okay, so any discussion? Jenny?
I would just like to comment on some of the church architecture, just with my background, that there's a spectrum of churches that are visible within our community. Some are more modern, that could be maybe more apt to be mistaken for another building use. And there are others that are more prominent, where they have bell towers, stained glass, steeples. So there are architectural elements that signify to the community that this is, in fact, a church, not a commercial use or other function. So I admit I am more apt to, from just the church standpoint, to consider that when a conditional use is being brought forward, that there'd be some way to treat it differently than something that a church that has all these elements, that is visibly a church within the community. So I think that some of the fine arts and the martial arts, I've taken photography, sculpture, painting. I've also done Taekwondo. These studios for teaching, I think, could be applicable for residential use. However, I do struggle a little bit with the church for being located within a church, just because of especially those that are designed specifically for the function of a church.
Okay, other comments?
I have a comment. I'm one of the few that have argued against having even the medical and dental offices in the R5. I think over the past 3 or 4 years I've been pretty adamant against that. I was overruled most of the time. I'm still against having medical dental use and anything else commercial inside the R5. So I would at the very least like to propose that we change the R5 zoning district to be a conditional use in this, as well as the other R3, R3X, and R4. And I would like to make that as a proposal.
Okay.
I'll second that.
So it's been moved by Kurt and seconded by Steve to change the permitted use to conditional use in the R5 zone district. Do we have any discussion? Ready to?
As long as everybody understands that a yes vote on this is not necessarily going to translate into a yes vote on the entire ordinance. Okay.
Okay, all those in favor of that? That is everybody in favor? Okay, any other comments?
I think to address, Jenny, going back to your comments about the architectural interest or what distinguishes a church, I wonder if we could propose something as in the section of conditional uses to ensure that in the case of, from an architectural perspective, that be maintained. I think we'd probably have to define what are those architectural elements, but that might be a way to address that.
Do we have a second on that?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved by Karina and seconded by Jenny to have something somewhere that says to ensure from an architectural perspective that the church elements be maintained.
The church what?
And especially if there's a historic significance to the church or the structure itself. There are, and maybe not, it depends on the situation, but some churches are designed where they have very beautiful elements that are incorporated into the structure. And so I just somehow would like to, I think, just ensure that those, if it is a significant structure or church structure, that we do acknowledge that and preserve it.
Who decides that? How are we going to put that into writing?
That's a good question.
And where do we put it?
So does it at all come into play in the design standards that are outlined for the city? Or is that only specific to a
Right now,
certain area?
that's only specific to downtown. We've talked about looking to expand that to other areas, but that's a distant possibility at this point.
Dave?
I guess my concerns would be, aside from the question of judgment, what's worth retaining and what's not. So we're saying we're going to convert a church to some other use, primarily because churches tend to have features that are very distinctive and announced to everybody. Iconic, could use the word iconic. Features that identify it to anyone living around there or going by that's a church. If we're turning it to a martial arts studio or a dance studio, I don't know why we need to insist that it be maintained, that we maintain the iconic appearance of a church. I have the same problem with any other building that is presented in one way, even though it is totally contrary to the actual character of the use or nature of the building. But in this case in particular, I'm sympathetic to the idea if you've got a real gem out there, it'd be nice to preserve it somehow. I'm just not sure how we can dictate that up front, objectively.
I'm sympathetic to that also, but think about the rights of the property owner on how we would tell them that they can't do it because we think their building looks nice, or we think their building looks iconic. If it's a historic type building, the Historic Preservation Board will have already declared it as something that they can't mess with. But hate to take away somebody's property rights just because we feel that this church wouldn't make a good gym or a good fine arts building.
We also are talking about schools too, not only churches but schools. So, any other comments before we take a vote?
Glenn, would this be an area where Historic Preservation Board could take an interest in a particular building of merit or features in a building of merit and make some sort of a case to the Planning Commission, City Council, or otherwise that certain of those elements be preserved and, some alternative means for preserving them?
I'll take a stab at that one. Your purview is more in the area of the uses, and HPB is more in the area of the aesthetics of the building, and that would come into play whether a building is on the list of merit or has been designated as a landmark. And I think it's important that we have that communication through your liaison if that were to come up with a particular building. So I think it is best if you all don't address the aesthetic piece of what we don't know exists or not, but if it comes up in a particular application, it could be dealt with through HPB.
And really, conceivably, if it affects both, okay, granted, we're primarily looking at uses, but also within our purview is form. So at some point, it's conceivable that a particular situation could inspire some sort of collaboration between HPB and the Planning Commission and DRC about, okay, here are certain elements that are worth preserving. What are the alternative ways of doing it while still maintaining the integrity of the zoning and the uses and the building forms?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And I think that's a good idea to be watching for and to refer to HPB or have the discussion with them.
Thank you.
Hearing those comments, I actually withdraw my motion.
Okay. Jenny, do you agree to withdraw?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. Craig, you had a comment?
I guess that following up on that, the way I read the ordinance, the way it's drafted, the use would be conducted within a non-residential structure that was constructed for a church or school. So that indicates to me that it's an existing structure and it's not going to be modified for that change of use. Am I interpreting that correctly? Or?
If I could, Madam Chair, I would say yes, and I would look at that section 4, and if you want to add verbiage to the point that it shall typically maintain an outward appearance of a church or school, I mean, I think maybe that gets to some of the same concerns that Commissioner Ranville raised. And those are things that you would be under your purview to look at when the conditional use permit comes before you.
If I can follow up, I'm kind of struggling with this a little bit. I'm on the fence. I see this as an appropriate sort of adaptive reuse of a facility on a case-by-case basis. However, I'm concerned about setting precedents and unintended consequences which may come from use in a different district or modifications of the structure, tearing it down, rebuilding something that's specific to that particular use, when I think the intent was adaptive reuse of unused structures.
Exactly. Right.
But again, I think we're getting into Steve's area of concern about dictating to or constraining ownership rights on private property owners. If an owner of an abandoned or disused church or school decides that he wants to recondition, reshape this building without those elements, that's his choice. We're not yet to the point where we are mandating protection or preservation of those elements on private property, other than in the historic district.
Okay. Any other questions, amendments?
We're still on the main issue, the main ordinance. I've got 2 comments, and I'm going to offer them, preface it by saying I'm going to vote against this. Number one, I understand fully why 40 years ago, limiting uses in these residential areas to residential purposes other than institutional uses, emphasis on the word institutional, churches and schools, and then depending on which part of the code you read, health-related or health-supporting services or supporting health services. I understand that. At the time, churches largely, schools almost exclusively served the direct neighborhood in which they were located. Businesses do not. In addition to that, the one single, absolutely consistent request from every neighborhood under the existing comm plan was protect us from the intervention of outside commercial and industrial uses. Quite frankly, that's my understanding of what zoning is all about, is protecting or metering between different uses. To concede this kind of a change in the ordinance is abandoning that. Literally, in the community-wide section of the existing comm plan, which still has the force of, gee, it's not law, what is it, moral suasion. Under Land Use Policy 4, it says, literally, word for word, it is undesirable and unnecessary to introduce additional commercial land use in the interior of Progress, Kettering, or Stern Park neighborhoods. I rest my case. I'm going to vote no.
Anybody else? Steve?
This actual building, where it is, I think, is very appropriate to be used as what they're intending it to be used. With the park right next to it, I see, taking the, karate or taekwondo classes and bringing them out and doing the classes out in the park and, expanding it out there. So with this particular unit or building, I have no absolute problem with this at all. My problem that I have with this is the consequences that is unintended in other places in town that we have not thought about or have not crossed our mind yet on where we're going to be throwing a commercial business in the middle of somebody's neighborhood. And I really wish that we could figure out a way that this one could be allowed.
I see one possibility, if I can throw this one in, even though it undermines my argument, or at least long-term. The sheriff's property right now is zone B2, isn't it? The owner of the sheriff's property, in considering redevelopment of that property, is also talking or had options on purchasing the R3 properties on the west side of Bemis Street that are also immediately opposite the street from this property in question. If that property would get redeveloped and those residential lots be rezoned with that redevelopment, it would then be this site would then be contiguous with that B2 use. The zoning prohibition against rezoning, for less than 180,000 square feet is non-contiguous, isolated zones. If this is contiguous and the street does not break the contiguity, is that pronounced right? It could, in fact, piggyback along with that kind of a development on the sheriff's property. Correct? There's your possibility.
But that's a dependency, so if that were to happen.
However remote that might be.
Can I have a better understanding of conditional use? So if this is presented as conditional use, then any other scenario that comes up, another property, do we get to evaluate that as well? So just as we're saying, this one makes sense for where it is and what we believe the impact will be to the neighborhood. When another property comes in, do we get to make that same assessment, or no, it's already permitted under conditional use?
No, they would have to go through the same process. If any church wants to change and allow teaching of fine arts, they would be back before you through a conditional use.
And we would go through that same evaluation of impact to the neighborhood, where it's located, what the intended use is.
Parking.
And we would inevitably find ourselves sooner or later in a situation where the rule of law is set aside for personal circumstances and the personal judgments of 7 people on the Planning Commission and or the City Council, which is, I believe, one of the major issues that the public identified to us during the outreach process is making sure that procedures and guidelines were clear and objective and equitably applied rather than dependent on personal whim and situation. I don't see any reason to add to what we've already identified as a situation needing some correction in the city.
Any other comments?
And just following up on that, with a conditional use, I think that the planner usually presents the goals from the comprehensive plan for that neighborhood to either support or oppose a conditional use request. And following up on David's comment, I see in the neighborhood goals for this, goal 3 is prohibit encroachment of commercial uses. It's pretty strongly worded, so if we were to support this ordinance, there's still a good chance that it would be declined on conditional use for that reason.
And you'll find similar language in the other neighborhood plans, so why even entertain it?
Any other comments? Are we ready to vote? All those in favor?
It didn't. She withdrew.
Oh, wait, sorry. That's Elrod voting yes, and the motion fails. Okay, so that takes us to public hearings. And seeing that we have no public hearings, how about reports from the staff?
We don't have anything.
Okay. HP Board? Nothing?
Nope.
Any commissioners? Nothing? And there's nothing from the chair. So that takes us to adjournment to a special meeting to address the downtown area plan. We vote to adjourn to a special meeting? That is everybody in favor? And Dennis, do we need to give you a minute to set up? Can we take a 4-minute break to allow Dennis to set up?
copy. So worried about we lost our audience.
Okay, this is the special meeting to address the downtown area plan, and I kind of want to get you up to speed as to, I've talked to the mayor regarding this, and one of the things that we proposed is looking at 5 subjects and then filling out this spreadsheet, presenting tomorrow 5 subjects for about 5 minutes each, and those subjects would be height, the R5 area, the framework, Dr. Cog, and the sunset rules. And the reason to do this is because that was the top, that was identified as some of the top concerns from the city council members.
Could you read those again?
Yeah, it's
Can't
height, the R5 area, the framework, Dr. Cog, and the sunset provisions. So what I was hoping for is we would have, and for those who are going to be at tomorrow's meeting, some volunteers to address the various topics. I mean, I would be willing to do height if you guys want, but I mean, we still have the R5, the framework, Dr. Cog, and the sunset rules. So do we potentially have any volunteers?
I would say, since I'm the one that introduced the sunset, it would probably be a good idea for me to step up and take that one.
Okay. And Dennis has some supporting materials, too, that you can look through and decide what you want to use. So it's not that you have to do this all blindly.
This is for presentation
This is
or
for the-
response to council tomorrow night,
Right, a response to council tomorrow night.
verbally supplementing a written.
Verbally supplementing a written response on these spreadsheets. And council would like to have a modified spreadsheet with our draft responses emailed to them first thing tomorrow morning, so they'll have time to review our responses and to see if they've got any questions.
So we are going to have time tonight to discuss the essential elements of that response.
Absolutely,
verbal.
absolutely. I was hoping that we'd go one by one through all of our 70-some, or some of our responses to either, what we did is, on this worksheet, we came up with a draft response, and see if you guys agree with those draft responses. And some of those were based on Craig's and Dave's comments, so. Craig?
Thanks. Can I suggest that we start with the ones that are in those 5 categories, so we make sure we get them through them all, and then if we have time, we can do the rest?
Sure, we can do that. Yeah, that's a good idea. But they're all over the place and they're hard to find.
Well, 4 of the 6 on the first page are in that category.
Or as we start with one and talk that through, as we move on down the list and encounter it again, we can just sit there and say number 1, number 2, and hope we've make sure we've encompassed all aspects of the questions or the comments in the first place.
Mm-hmm. So do we want to start with that? And then start with the spreadsheet, we've got, this is all chronological order, the way that the city council members presented them. And we have an actual number of the comment is on the left-hand side, the council person that made the recommendation, the page number on the comp plan of where the goals or policy or implementation strategy is. The comment is the comment that was made by the city council member, and then we want to look at the column that says draft response, and that is a draft that we put together, Dennis and Sarah Jane and I put together this afternoon based on some of Craig's comments and Dave's comments too. So should we start with number 2?
Can I raise a general issue first that we ought to keep clear in our minds after we make sure we have it clear in our minds? Mm-hmm. As I understand it, we've talked about this in the past. The Planning Commission has the power to, oh heck, I'm not going to try and read it. When it comes to the comprehensive plan, the Planning Commission proposes, council disposes, correct? final say on this, details, yes or no, overall, is council's, not ours.
That's right. It's subject to council approval.
Okay. I just want to make sure we all understand that, because there's been some representation in the past that this was our job, our responsibility, our duty, our power, and it is only we are only empowered to propose it.
Well, what I'm anticipating seeing tomorrow is that they'll take our comments, and then they'll actually be voting on specific recommendations for us to include at the following week's city council meeting. So it's much more discussion tomorrow, and then they'll formulate their ideas and actually vote on it the following meeting. Okay, we ready to go? So number two, and that's the establish sunset provisions for all rezoning and developing applications. Any comments on the comment or the draft response?
I'm going to question some of the wording. Unless I'm misreading what we intended and what we put in there, it is not completely optional in its application. And it's not optional for them, the staff, the commission, or the community to choose to rescind a dormant plan. What we said was that we would impose a fixed time limit for any approved rezoning or development plan. The only provision is, only other provision is that under extenuating circumstances, such approval, such time limit could be extended. But we did not. This is what got us into trouble with Dave Randall and his perception. He was sitting there thinking, you're giving the DRC, the Planning Commission, City Council, the arbitrary power to decide when to impose a time limit. That's not what we said. We said we're imposing a time limit across the board, but there may be extenuating circumstances when an extension could be warranted and granted. If I'm wrong on that, show me where that's worded the way that this says, but I don't see it. And that's certainly not what I accepted when we talked about it.
Well, the exact way that it's written is if the development is not started in a given time frame, the city can, at its discretion, extend or not extend the time frame.
Right. But
So there is an option at that point.
An option to extend, not an option to impose. We are imposing. I just don't want this to be misleading. Again, one of the three top things we kept hearing from the community and outreach was, for God's sake, simplify the procedures, make them clear, and make them objective and follow the rules instead of reinterpreting. So let's make this clear. If we're calling for a fixed time limit, we never did get around to deciding whether it's 5 years or 10 years, then let's make it clear and not equivocate. It is a fixed time limit that may, as conditions warrant, be extended. If that's not what we mean, then let's say that explicitly too.
Well, the policy says to establish sunset. It doesn't actually say what the provisions are.
So it would be setting the time frame in those sunset provisions and setting the regulation.
But we are going to set a time limit.
Don't we every now and then feel compelled to actually say something specific instead of just throwing it back for somebody else to solve it? We
So why
talked
don't we-
about a specific time limit, generally applicable,
How
with
about we-
exceptions as they come up.
How about we add the intention is to impose a specific time limit to the draft response, or do we want to add it to the goals and policy?
You know, why don't we feel Craig's response is suggesting that this is a tool. So we're setting the guidelines and still allow for discretionary review. The point that I see that we're missing is that we haven't set the time frame. We've set the guideline, but we haven't set the time frame.
We have set the implementation strategy duration at 24 months.
That's the time frame for developing a specific set of sunset provisions.
Yes.
Right.
So we have 24 months to develop the provisions. We don't need to be coming up with the exact provisions now.
I thought Dave Randall merely misunderstood what our statement and what our intent was about the sunset provision, about setting a time limit across the board, but allowing for extensions. I find now from the discussion up here that I'm wrong. I was that Dave Randall read this better than I do. The way this reads and the way our draft response reads, it says it's wide open. It gives arbitrary power to the city to impose or extend any time provision. It doesn't say anything to the contrary in this.
Okay, how would you propose changing the wording? And I think we could say this adds a tool and get rid of completely optional in its application and is not currently available to staff.
How about this as a
Sorry,
suggestion? This adds a tool allowing some discretion in its application, that's not currently available to staff. I don't want to get into the weeds on as far as describing exactly what it says in the implementation policy here.
And that's it, nothing else?
And then the rest would remain the same. Instead of saying completely optional, I'm suggesting we say that allows some discretion.
Doesn't that mean the same thing?
This means the same thing unless you sit there and say what we talked about at the time. That it places a uniform time limit on any rezoning or development plan approved. The only choice available is to extend the time as specific situations warrant. That was the thrust of the discussion that led up to this. How it got translated into the current published plan is another story altogether. But if we still leave this to imply that we're leaving it open to staff, DRC, Planning Commission, or City Council arbitrarily to decide whether to impose or extend a time limit, rather than merely to extend a time limit, we are being as arbitrary and subjective as public comment told us we needed to avoid being 4 years ago.
So what if we take the goals and policies and get rid of if development has not started in a given timeframe, the city can at its discretion extend or not extend the timeframes and just leave established sunset provisions? Will that address the issues in the goals and policy? No?
So you just delete the last sentence?
Delete the last sentence, and then it would be the establishment of the sunset provision that will set those parameters.
Okay, then let me try it this way. I'll make a motion.
Okay.
Delete the language altogether. This places a uniform time limit on any rezoning or development plan approved. The only choice available is to extend the time limit if as a specific situation warrants.
I second that.
So you're proposing to put where?
What's in there right now as the
draft response?
As the draft response.
Okay, can you say that one more time?
This would place a uniform time limit on any rezoning or development plan approved. Okay, let's use a popular word. The only flexibility available is to extend the time as and if a specific situation warrants. Now that still leaves us to wrestle with what is unreasonably short versus what is unrealistically long. I'd hate to think, Glenn, please reassure me that determining this will not take 24 months.
Okay. Karina, do you agree to his changes?
I do.
Okay. So do we won't take a formal, but we'll raise hands.
Can we read that again? I'm sorry.
The way I hear it is the only flexibility would be to extend the time frame if the situation warrants. Is that right?
I've got it written down for once. Isn't that amazing?
Okay.
This would place a uniform time limit on any rezoning or development plan approved. The only flexibility available is to extend the time if and as a specific situation warrants.
Actually, the only issue or hesitation I have with that is, I'm hearing it again, it's a uniform time limit for any development, and some category of development may be more short-term in nature than long-term in nature, depending on the complexity or how big of a development it is. So I'm a little, so when I hear uniform, it would mean, and I'll use this as an example, 5 years, regardless of whether you're changing a 10,000 square foot area or a 100,000 square foot area. So that would be my only hesitation, and I don't know if that is the, as you're stating uniform, if the intent was one time period for all, or this provision would be evaluated and set, and maybe set some subcategories to it.
I think I see where you think that might go. I'd like to think that the whole idea of providing for consideration of specific situations for extending the time limit would come into play.
So if we were to extend it, so one could also then suggest it could be as short as 3 years, right? If the only option is to...
I think we'd get a lot of resistance and a lot of criticism from the business community suggesting that they have to do something, pull the trigger in 3 years or it's rescinded. By that time, they'll have invested a lot of time in advocating for and getting the rezoning or the development plan in place. 3 years is, I would say, unreasonably short by anybody's definition.
And so a property owner then, let me just think this through for a second. So if we were to set a longer limit, like 5 years or 10 years, at any point in time during that 5 year or 10 year, if they change their position, there's nothing precluding them from saying, I'm not going to develop it. That property doesn't hold for 5 years under that given change or provision.
I can see, I understand where you're going with this, and whether it's a category, a type of rezoning or development, or the size, or the location, that might make, a rezoning from an RE to what's the category went up from that, RA, or vice versa, probably not that significant in terms of time. Changing from a B2 to a CA, depending on what the surroundings are, could be an entirely different situation as far as how time sensitive those conditions, the conditions that warrant that rezoning in the first place might be. So how about this? If we are going to take the time, or ask staff to take the time to develop a policy, a set of time limits based on category, condition, whatever, at least we're maintaining the idea that we're going to set time limits in writing for everyone to know when they approach the city for a permit or a rezoning, and they can look at the table or the category and say, okay, it's this type of development or it's in this kind of an area. Our time limit is going to be 10 years instead of 5 years or 15 years. But at least it's written down. It isn't subject to the passing whims of DRC or Planning Commission or City Council, other than if conditions warrant, under their judgment, they can extend it. So I can accept adding develop a definitive set of standards or set of time limits or whatever. Somebody else can wordsmith that. I came with this prepared, but does that at least sound like a reasonable compromise, Glenn?
Well, one thing I want to make sure that I'm on the same page, and you're really talking about new cases from this point forward. Okay, good. Then really, I mean, you're appointed to kind of represent the community, and the council is. So I think it's going to be tough to say in all cases it will be X. That's just a difficult thing to do.
So provide some flexibility. Come up with a table.
We could try that based on, I guess, the intensity of the impact, perhaps. I'm not sure. I mean, we could take a shot at it, but I guess my feeling is I hate to tie the decision makers too much, because you just never know what you're going to be faced with. But we could maybe build some ideas of what we'd look at based on traffic impact, the level of impact that a proposed project might have, that Therefore, you get 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. Is that kind of what you're thinking, Commissioner? That
I have some proposed language, set time limits that are consistent, flexible, and available to all applicants. I mean, it's simple, short, conveys the intent.
And I think what we're trying to suggest here is, I don't know that I am not necessarily trying to suggest what the definition of that category might be, but that there seems to be more than one time limit. I think back to the different criterias, even when we're doing plans. So what is a plan development and how extensive that process is versus permitted use in rezoning. So it's how do we assess some level of complexity, and with that level of complexity, there's a time limit associated with it. And it's almost a level of effort, right? So if someone is going through a lot of effort for a plan development, then we should allow for an extended timeline for them to fulfill that development.
I think typically with a rezoning case, there's a certain amount of give and take, and you may want them to do additional buffering of an existing neighborhood, and therefore they get a longer time to make that work. I mean, it's one tool, and I like the term tool. It's one of those things you can use to negotiate a good case for whatever particular neighborhood it's in. So if you say it's only X if it's Y, then you're limiting yourself, I think, in using that tool.
And that takes me back to Craig's recommended language. It adds a tool allowing some discretion in its applications that's not currently available.
I'm still uncomfortable with the idea of some discretion. It's wide open. It means anything any group in the future wants it to mean. So let me try this, and Karina, see if this sounds like a rewording that would be acceptable to you. This would establish a clearly differentiated set of time limits / by category, scale, or impact area on rezoning or development plans approved, and then continue on. So we're saying it is going to be a definite limit. It is going to, at the time, the definite limits posted will recognize what the different conditions are. So somebody coming into the city will know, given their category or their scale or their location, what the applicable time limit's going to be. Nobody's going to sit there and negotiate with them or exercise personal discretion over what that is. And I think that is the heart of what a lot of the objections we were hearing were based on. And quite frankly, I think that's the heart of what we were trying to do when we talked about this. Although I'm speaking for Steve, and Steve's the one who brought it up. So, Steve, is this?
Say that again, your motion.
This would establish a clearly differentiated set of time limits by category, scale, or impact area, and then continue on any rezoning or development plan approved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So it would be some sort of a tiered table type thing.
We've got kind of an unusual situation tonight. Typically, when we put the minutes together from a meeting, we have the tape, the videotape. Because City Council wants this first thing in the morning, we won't have that. So if I could ask each of you who offers a motion to write that motion down so that we actually have your exact wording, I think we'll get it correct that way, and I'm not sure we will otherwise. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
Question for Dennis and Glenn. Is that wording sound feasible and
practical?
Practical.
Sure, I think we do our best to provide that to you.
You know, is there anything that motion is leaving out that we're not thinking about?
Boy, I wish I could see in the future.
You know, I mean, trying to delve into your professional opinions here with the sunset provision, you know. And
well, my experience has been that with a sunset provision, you're asking an applicant to only have X amount of time to vest their zoning, basically, is what we look at, which means they've done development plans, they've expended a serious amount of money to get the project out of the ground. Now, in my experience, typically, if a developer would have to agree to that as a part of his PD zoning, let's say. If they don't, then, I mean, that's something you would consider whether you approve it or not. It's just one of those things. But I don't think it's just something that we can just force upon an applicant. They either agree or they don't agree. And if they don't agree, then perhaps they don't get their zoning. I don't know if that helps you in your decision making. And we can do our best to create a matrix to give you guidance that, so I think you want to be consistent, right? I think that's your basic goal, that somebody, just because somebody made a better case than somebody else, that somehow we weren't being fair. And I think that's a good goal. So we can do our best to make a simple matrix that you apply. It's just, it's hard to tell you every case that's going to come down the road. And I'll just give you one idea. I think, for instance, the mayor raised when we reviewed this 2 weeks, that this is only a land use plan and it should only deal with land use issues. And I would tend to say you want as much information from either sustainability, economic development, whatever it might be, to make a decision. And this would be one of those things of whether the applicant is serious and they would come through in a 3 to 5 year time frame and develop it. That's just one of those other things. But it's not, it's still gonna, there's still gonna be some discretion there. And I don't know how to tell you that there wouldn't be.
But I think what this is trying to do is at least kind of lay out the rules of the game. And then the applicant can say, okay, I understand, that's the rules I'm abiding by, and then they can present, well, here's why mine would be an exception. So at least we're starting objectively, and then allow for an exception to the process as the situation warrants, as they need to prove. It's slightly, it gives, I think, applicants at least the same starting point, although we are still, and we have to recognize, we still are allowing variations to that would be subjective. But at least I think we set at least a standard to guide the process.
It's trying to draw a fine line between, what was the word you used, Craig? It wasn't flexibility, it was discretion. And rigid guidelines. Discretion in recognition that there are going to be extenuating circumstances and there is need for more than just a single time limit. Fixed limits, recognizing that we've told the public, or we heard from the public, that they wanted the processes to be more nailed down, less loosey-goosey. They have some better idea of what to expect when they came in. And let's face it, I don't care, it's like a contract. A handshake and with a few words on a napkin or a 12-inch thick document. Somebody, sooner or later, may choose to dispute or shave meanings. Deal with it, that's human nature. But at least we're trying to level the playing field, make it clearly defined, give people something more concrete to expect when they come in with an application.
So
That's all we can do.
Is your proposal to delete the language in the draft response and replace it with the establish a clearly differentiated set of time? Okay.
Given what Steve pointed out, that back in our implementation table, we're giving ourselves 24 months. That implies that this, as stated, is not, the policy as stated is not all there is to it, that we are looking to develop a policy. This is providing the framework.
It's something else we need to talk about, because I think we've got different interpretations of that time frame. When we put that together, we were looking at kind of a discrete time in terms, and if you read through the introduction, it says there's a lot of flexibility. We weren't looking at adoption and then 24 months. You know, we were looking at a 24-month period discrete whenever that starts, wherever City Council gives the go-ahead to do those things. So it may not start immediately. So yeah, that's
okay.
Okay.
So it's like the frequent references in the existing comp plan saying the city needs to reconsider the zoning details, et cetera, that never got reconsidered. It really depends on council to authorize you to do that.
Can we address that
Everything in this does, yeah, it sure does.
Can we address that in the implementation, when we get to implementation strategies?
We can but try.
Okay, I want to also propose something I heard from you, Karina. You used the words provides an applicant the same starting point and set of standards to guide the process. I think that would be a good explanation to include in that.
That really is that's the general approach we try to take in several different references to administrative processes and applications and everything else. I think this says what it needs to do. There was a fear when this came up that this opened the door to arbitrariness, and we're trying to close that door. There's a concern about why are you trying to do this, and what we're trying to say is, look, you need to set a limit. You don't leave it wide open and say, once you got approval, no matter what changes around you, that approval's good. Okay, those are the two ways we're trying to, the two limits we're trying to set around
Steve?
this.
And I want to make sure that with what you just said is accurate, is this is based on after approval, not through the whole application process. The sunset provision would kick in at approval time. Yeah. So it'd be a certain time after that. You know, I mean, it may take 2 years to go through the application process and all that, but it'll all start when the approval happens.
If it make you feel better, when it says on all rezonings or development plans approved, we could say on all rezonings or development plans after approval or upon approval.
Upon approval.
Karina, that?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. Mm-hmm.
All right, are we ready to agree on the language and move forward? What does everybody think? Just raise your hand if you, and Matt too, is that everybody is for that language? So can we move on with sunset? And
That's one.
Dave, can you write that down for me, seeing as I'll have to, thank you.
okay, and which do you recommend?
One was
next?
R5.
Yep. So number 3. And who wants to do the presentation on R5? Going once, going twice? Okay, Kurt, thank you. Dennis has a whole packet of information for you.
Smaller, Linda gets the biggest one with height. Chris is a little smaller, and Steve's is very, very small. So,
I trade with Steve.
Okay, that takes us to,
The one thing I'm going to question in the proposed response, I'm not sure we saw surface parking lots as any kind of buffer between businesses and the CA and the residential uses.
are you talking 3?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or 4.
Well, okay, but it's all the same subject. It's the R5. We're going to try and coalesce all the R5 related items into one. Isn't that our intent here?
But I think we should address them separately because that's how they requested the response to be.
Well,
I mean, I know
the
we can
individual
in the
council people
presentation.
requested them to be responded to individually, but Doug Clark has suggested that they all be grouped into 5 categories. One of the categories is the R5.
And we'll
I
address them in
presume
the
we're going to address
presentation.
all of them in one lump sum.
Right.
Okay, so my question is, or my comment is, I don't think we even talked about parking lots as a buffer. What we really talked about is not allowing parking for an off-site, out-of-zone, out-of-district business to replace or impact the integrity of this residential neighborhood, based on what our rationale for saying not only did we hear people saying they really valued the existing character of this neighborhood, but their actions, their concrete actions in remodeling, upgrading, modernizing, landscaping these properties said that this was more than just a passing whim on their part. They're dedicated to the idea. So what we said was taking out a house to put in a parking lot just because it happens to be adjacent to a CA zone is inappropriate.
Right.
I just didn't want to leave the door open for somebody to say.
I think my comment is saying the same thing, but the way that the draft response is written, I don't see anything about buffer in there.
I just don't want to open the door for somebody saying, well, you know, it might be a good buffer. Well, it isn't. It might arguably be a decent buffer if it's outside that district and adjacent, but not as replacing an element of that district.
Okay, what about adding at the end of number 4, taking out a house to put in a parking lot is inappropriate? Or something like that, just to clarify what the statement says.
I just don't like the idea of desirable buffer. I don't want to start getting into a contest with somebody over desirable, undesirable, less desirable, more desirable. It isn't a buffer.
So how would you
We never
delete?
saw it as
We're
a
not
buffer.
saying
We
that.
saw it as an intrusion.
It's not in the draft response, so I think the draft response is fine.
Yeah, see the draft response over to the right?
Say buffer at all.
You got to look.
R4. Again, I'm trying to pull together all the R5 related comments. The next one is too.
To number 4.
None of these say anything about a buffer.
Yeah, it doesn't say buffer.
Current zoning allows property owners to build surface parking in the R5 zone. We did not
Look
see
at-
surface parking lots as the
look at this.
desirable buffer.
That's Craig's response.
Oh,
My response. It's just the way I wrote it.
here we go again. Too many copies of similar documents.
Okay, so
I'm sorry. I apologize.
any changes to recommend to
Let's
number
look
3
at
or
number
number
3.
4?
Can we look at number 3
Yes.
first? I don't understand why the first sentence is in there.
Because we're going to have a separate topic on the
Well, you could
R5.
say that about everything.
But aren't we going to have that on all these?
Not necessarily, not when we get to a lot of these other issues. We won't be discussing things like parking or as a separate topic.
So are we going to preface each of these 5 subjects with, this will be addressed separately in a present?
That's the way it's been set up so far. So anytime it hits the height, the R5, the framework, Dr. Cogger, sunset, it says that this will be addressed separately, and then it also gives a little comment.
But we didn't say that about the sunset clause.
Didn't say that about sunset.
Okay, we can add it.
Is that was that your intent, Linda, or I just heard you say that we were addressing parking separately? Do you remember
No,
what this
it
intended?
would be to any subject that we are going to
One of those
address.
5?
Yeah, of those 5. So for number 2, we want to add, this will be addressed separately. Okay, so
Maybe
back
we
to
ought to
number
put it
3.
in bold or underline it or something to call attention to that, Dennis. Is that
We can color it.
or whatever. Otherwise, it just kind of gets lost in the text. And what we're trying to do is call attention to it. Say, hey, guys, there are 5 issues we're going to talk about separately. This is one of them.
Okay, back to number 3.
Well, I think we can just emphasize that we thoroughly talked about the full range of additional uses that might happen within the R5 and heard pretty strongly from the neighborhood that leaving it as is a good limit.
So are you okay with the language that says meetings with the R5 neighborhood strongly supported keeping this use as is?
I think so.
And should we add the word thoroughly to saying we thoroughly discussed expanding permissible uses? Yes?
Yeah, and the neighborhood was
Endlessly?
was real firm on allowing the medical uses too. They didn't have a problem with that.
Yeah, want to bet the next time somebody comes in wanting to convert a house to a medical use, they do a flip-flop on us? I'll start a pool. Give me a call.
Okay, so
Is the last sentence in 4 really what we want to say? Are we really talking about building parking structures?
do you mind if we finish 3 real quick so that we can go to 4?
Okay.
So you guys,
I'm still not clear. Are we talking about 5 categories?
we're talking about our 5 categories,
Okay.
the height, the R5, the framework, Dr. Cog, and sunset provisions, and we're talking about the responses that we had based on the questions that the city council people had, individual questions.
Okay.
So for the number 3, we added thoroughly, and did we want to add neighborhood strongly believed in maintaining medical and dental uses?
I don't know. I think at this point it's kind of
same.
Yeah, and nobody
Okay.
challenged whether we're allowing medical and dental. They challenged why that was the only thing we were allowing.
Probably because they didn't know that medical and dental was the only ones allowed in their
Oh,
code.
come on, they know that.
Well, I'm sure they do, but
Okay, so are we okay to move, do we agree that the language is good with adding the thoroughly and number 3? So all those in favor of that? So that is unanimous, so let's move to 4. Sorry, Dave.
Can I just add something? I think we need to allow staff to do the wordsmithing here and just really talk about what the core intent is. Otherwise, we're never going to get through all these. I mean, each one of these, I think we had a good reason for putting in the plan, and we just have to ferret out those key reasons and let staff write it up. And then I think what I'm talking about when I say strongly or broadly, it's more about how it's presented to council, because it's going to be discussed verbally. So,
Okay, so number 4.
I have no problem with that language.
Yeah, again,
Oh, wait, the last sentence, I think there was an issue, yeah.
Right now, what the code calls for is parking lots. I don't think it goes any farther than that, does it? Okay. So really, there's nothing in here. No need to address parking structures.
So do you guys want to delete the last sentence?
Should it say parking areas or surface parking?
Surface parking lots. Yeah.
Yeah, it gets to the feel for what we were trying to do, is to avoid allowing things like this to nibble away at the integrity of this neighborhood.
Okay. Delete the last sentence. Everybody's okay with that? No problems? Gone. And add surface parking. Any other changes to that one?
So I'm wanting to ensure that we're addressing the comment here. This has a huge impact on downtown. You would like to understand this. So I think what we're just rationalizing here is that a decision has been made, or the proposal has been made, that we would not allow parking structures adjacent to residential homes. So it's just a statement of our proposal, but it's not necessarily addressing, he would like to understand this. What is it that we're telling? I mean, how are we making him understand it other than just making a statement of?
He understands
Some
it.
additional background might be helpful. Currently, there are no situations where this occurs. There are no surface parking lots in the R5 that are adjacent to the CA. So it's rather hypothetical at this point that this would occur. We do have one vacant lot, the west side of Nevada Place. That would take some major process to get that to be anything than what it's proposed to be. So it would require somebody to come in and acquire housing and tear it down. We've not seen that, and then it's conditional use on top of that. So there are no surface lots, no surface parking space that will be lost at this point. And when you look at how large the R5 is and how many lots there are possibly adjacent to the CA, and it has to be immediately adjacent to it, can't be even one lot separated. There aren't a lot of situations where this actually could occur. So I think there may be just a reassurance that this may not be the impact that people fear it might be. So I think it's that kind of discussion that might be helpful.
Effectively, it obviously would affect any property on Crestline. Well, it's not really CA, though. It's a
adjacent. Yeah, it has to be immediately adjacent. So it really would be on the north side of Powers. So those lots immediately north of
What about
Powers.
across the alley behind Prince, the properties on Prince, on the west side of Prince? The alley isn't going to, that's not going to break up the contingency, the contiguity.
Sure.
Why do I have to say that word twice in one night? I can barely pronounce it once.
Contiguity.
So, well, and really the same thing would apply. I mean, how is the Essex property zoned? Is that Is that a PD of some sort, or is it CA?
Essex is B2.
Is it B2? Okay. So really, we're only talking about the residential properties west of the alley behind the properties on the west side of Prince, and then the properties immediately north of Powers.
Right.
Although, there's a question about the property between the houses and South Santa Fe, north of the Melting Pot parking lot. How is that property zoned right now? Is that part of the CA?
So you're talking about Skunk Hollow?
Yeah, I was trying to avoid using that pejorative, but yeah, Skunk Hollow.
I think it's a nice term. There's a combination. There's some R5 that starts on the north side of that property. Most of the area where you actually see the parking lot itself is B2. Or excuse me, CA. That is CA.
So if somebody, the city or a public-private or a private developer would propose to come in and put a parking lot or parking garage there, they couldn't buy up a couple of those residential lots and extend into there. It's not a CA. It's not an adjacent CA zone.
There's an adjacent CA zone. Yeah, there is. So they could do that as a condition.
Well, then that just strengthens our argument for what we're trying to do to protect the R5 zone from that kind of encroachment.
And as the value of parking increases with parking demand, who knows? There could be other opportunities that come up.
It was a rather disingenuous question. He knew very well what the impact would be. It would be to limit the amount of, or the areas within the downtown football where public parking or privately funded public parking could be added. It puts more pressure on businesses, limiting or putting constraints on available parking. On the other hand, if we're trying to encourage a situation where the pressure becomes so severe that somebody sees a business opportunity to add a pay parking lot or parking structure, this only helps that.
So do we need to add any language to number 4, or is it good enough the way it is? And we can explain, and if that comes up tomorrow, we can explain it and talk about it.
I meant what I said in my comments. It does seem fairly obvious that would be what the impact of this is. So we might as well put it out on the table and talk about it. Unless we think differently, unless I'm expressing something that nobody else acknowledges.
Sorry, Matt.
I should have mentioned this earlier. I have to leave a little early tonight.
Okay.
What I'm trying to look up is if in our implementation summary, did we not say there was going to be a comprehensive parking plan?
We did.
And so with that, that parking plan is going to be developed with some of these policies and goals in mind.
Yeah, it's a constraint. What we're doing is identifying this as a constraint, and the parking plan is going to have to recognize that.
Work around that,
right,
or work with that. Okay.
Hold on. Matt, do you have anything that you want to mention?
No, and I won't be here tomorrow night. I mentioned that in an email earlier. I can't come.
Okay, thank you. Have a good evening. I almost view this issue as separate from the actual parking plan. I really do, because it's in the R5 area.
Yeah,
and
let's talk about it under parking.
I see this as, downtown Denver has a lot of private lots that are, vacant land that's the highest and best use for, and that's more the issue than the municipal parking requirements or the business parking requirements downtown. It's more about the market demand for parking.
I guess what I'm trying to balance in my mind, and I know there's a lot more comments around this, and why I was leaning on the parking plan to address this in a holistic fashion, is if we limit the development of parking structures or lots, et cetera, then we create the situation where people are parking in front of people's houses, and we create a different problem. So that's what I was just trying to balance for myself. And again, like I said, I am leaning on the parking plan to help address it more holistically. If that's a fair interpretation, then I think we're fine with where we're at for this comment. But
it's certainly the intent. Yeah.
Okay.
So everybody agree that we're fine with the comment? Can we vote and then move to the next one? Everybody agree? That is Jenny?
Yes.
Unanimous. So that takes us to our next item, which I think is number 10.
And the urban center, just one question. The parking reduction table was on the longer list. I guess it didn't make the short list of the top 5. So we're not talking about that.
No. It was the next one. It was number 6. So who would like to take Dr. Cog and address it briefly in tomorrow's presentation?
And that's the urban center designation we're talking about.
I was going to be here. I presented, but I can't make it, unfortunately.
Which item are we talking, which comment item are we?
Number
talking?
10?
Number 10, okay.
Urban center
Second from the last.
I will confess that when we talked about this April 26, 2010, I looked it up. I don't recall any discussion about these goals of 50% of housing, new housing development, and 70% of, what was the quote, Craig? Obviously, you're more familiar with it than I am.
Yeah, I just looked up on the website, and actually, I think at the time we discussed it, I mean, this is a new plan. It's just come out within the last 6 months.
I not only don't recall us discussing those particular aspects of it, and you're now explaining why, but quite frankly, I find those at odds with what we're trying to do through a lot of this plan. So I'm going to reconsider my previous support for the idea of trying to get urban center designation, because quite frankly, I don't find the goal of 50% of new housing and 75% of new employment growth to be in the downtown area of Littleton an admirable goal.
Well, and I think that once we present to City Council, they can make that recommendation when they come back to us, whether they agree with us or not. But it has to formally go to City Council. Even if it's in this plan, they're going to have to formally accept this and study it a lot more in-depth than what we're getting on.
What I'm saying is this is new information we didn't have when we first considered this, and I would like us explicitly to address that. Is this what we had in mind when we said we should pursue urban center designation? And if it is not consistent with the rest of the plan that we have scabbled together over the last 4 years, then I suggest we reconsider our support for pursuing urban center designation.
I think the distinction is it's throughout the region, and they're not saying within each municipality that's what you need to be doing. They're just saying, and they've got some very large urban centers. The way they're implementing that is that they're saying, accordingly, we're going to put that percentage of the funding that we get for infrastructure, and they do channel a lot of the federal funds for infrastructure into those areas so that we get that economy, that sustainability, economic sustainability of infrastructure. And that's the argument that they're putting forward. Certainly, they will not have a power over the zoning. They won't have a power over development review. It's just basically an access point to funding, I think.
I understand the permutations and combinations and the subtleties. What I find is that this goal, these goals as stated, are flatly contradictory to what we're putting in the comp plan.
Hold on. No, go ahead, Craig.
Well, I tend not to agree. I think they exactly support what I thought in terms of this, and they actually further support it in that it's about funding and support for infill in existing communities as opposed to greenfield development on
Well, then I want to exercise my right to recant my vote previously when we said with the directive to council or the report to council that one of the amendments we were going to make to the plan was to endorse the pursuit of urban center designation. I no longer believe that that is in the interest of this plan or this community.
Does that mean you don't want to present, David?
I'm sorry?
Does that mean you don't want to present?
How about the language like this? The PC voted to include this in the plan. The urban designation is a new designation and has not been thoroughly vetted by the Planning Commission, but the Planning Commission finds opportunities are great, and this should be pursued. This should be maybe pursued or vetted or addressed by both Planning Commission and City Council. What do you guys?
I find this just as objectionable as endorsing a bicycle and pedestrian master plan before we see its details. and how it's going, what it's going to do that may be at odds with what we were trying to do. In this case, it's even worse because we're sitting there saying, this is what the goals are, but not really.
But we voted on this, and I think we
voted on it with
have-
different information, Linda, and I'm saying with the new information, I'm saying no, I would not have voted for this, not in April of last year, and not this month or last month of this year.
And I didn't vote on it because I didn't have the information I needed to make that decision. But, you know, I mean, if maybe we can say this needs to be reviewed and explored. Sorry,
Well,
Jen.
I think with what Craig has mentioned with the urban centers is that basically all the cities in the metropolitan area are urban centers, but Littleton is one that hasn't gone forward to acknowledge that, and we are a city. There are smaller areas that are developments that are declared as urban centers, which it's kind of ironic that you would have an area that's just a development rather than a city, a downtown city. So, and this is for the whole metropolitan area. This doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be in the city of Littleton directing 50% of new housing or 50% of new employment growth. This is within the whole metropolitan area. So the percentage of that in Littleton is significantly smaller. So I think that the worry that this is going to be something that's, I really think that in general we should be, as a city, we are an urban center. We are what we are, and we will see how development moves forward. But we are a city, and we should be acknowledged as a city as part of DRCOG's urban center.
If nobody sees how this could be distorted and taken literally to say this should happen in the downtown area because we put it in the downtown area plan, then they haven't been paying attention to the issues that have racked this community for the last 6 years.
Steve?
Have we found anybody that's going to present this yet? Because I think Jen was doing great with it.
Well, you know, I'm actually not going to be at the meeting, so I'm not going to be available to do the presentation.
Okay, so Jen, if I understood you correctly, and I think Craig, you said this as well, this is intended, so urban designation would be for the city of Littleton, not specific to the downtown plan?
It's a small area within it. Actually, the area would be just the downtown area. And the city gets to define its own area, what are the boundaries, what are the parameters for that area, and then make an application to DRCOG. DRCOG, as Jenny has indicated, though, has actually gone through, and in the metropolitan area, they've identified areas that they have not been designated as urban centers. At least really should be the areas that we'd encourage to be. And other areas that they've designated in the past that they're beginning to question whether or not they should be or not. So they're thinking they're going to kind of get rid of some of those areas and probably fine-tune what they've got in there as they redefine what this really means. But it would be primarily smaller. There are two areas that possibly could be urban centers. I would think downtown could be, and longer term, if you want to look at the Mineral Light Rail Station area as an urban center, that might be as well. It requires a certain intensity of retail and residential, a mixture of uses. A density that doesn't have to be high, but it has to be a little higher than the surrounding area is the requirement. So it's a fairly broad definition of what they're looking for.
And I think we discussed a year ago, Dennis, that we're in pretty good shape for meeting those criteria. Right. And I have no problem with the rest of it. It's just this sudden reference to the goals of pushing 50% of new housing and 75% of new employment growth into this area.
What about changing the text to, this will be discussed at Tuesday's meetings. Littleton has not gone forward with the urban center designation. It is for the metro area, and the PC feels, the Planning Commission feels, the city should explore the urban designation and voted to include this in the plan. I mean, it's just.
I think that the balance of the response, most of, and all that, is really what we talked about a year ago. It's really what we had in mind when we voted on this 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago.
Language you would
So I'd say
propose?
get rid of the comments about the new housing and the new employment growth.
Okay, everybody agree to get rid of the comments on after this will be discussed?
Or at least qualify it to say that this is the goal of DRCOG. The city of Littleton would have to address this specifically to see how appropriate it is for the downtown area. I just don't want to open the door and have somebody come back 2 years ago with a new direction, a new emphasis on development at any cost. Does that sound familiar? And say, well, it said right here that you knew this was going to happen, so this is the justification for doing it. Don't pretend there aren't potential consequences just because you may find them unappetizing.
So are you suggesting that our goal is not to have urban center designation, but rather our goal is to evaluate Littleton or downtown Littleton areas adherence to that goal? So we're at the stage of evaluating, not necessarily stating we want to achieve this goal of urban designation?
Or if we take the last sentence, the most, and move it up front, and then put the rest of it in and say, the goal of Dr. Cog is da-da-da-da-da-da, semicolon, Littleton as a community would need to address the appropriateness of this as applied to the downtown area.
I think that's fair.
Thank you.
I would approve that.
If we start with most.
Okay, hold on. So most of the, so start with that. And do we include the section that says the goal of Dr. Cog is to direct 50% of new housing, or just delete that?
I think in case they don't know what those goals are, I think they should be in there.
As per my comment on a previous subject, to pretend that it isn't out there is silly. Let's lay it on the table, but let's put the caveat that we're not necessarily saying we're endorsing it. We're saying this is their goal. The city would need to address its applicability or suitability for the downtown.
So the last sentence is Littleton as a community would have to address this as appropriate for the downtown area.
Yeah, appropriateness, applicability. I think this is where, sorry, Dennis, this is where Craig's suggestion that we let staff wordsmith this properly rather than us trying to do it here could save us a lot of time, although could add to Dennis's ulcer development.
I would think Jim Taylor would be very well aware of the significance of the urban centers.
He may be, but the other council members may not.
Yeah, because this was from Bruce Stallman.
Yeah. So I would think once they get into the topic, he'll probably step up and thought about it.
So we're creating a directive here that the city would need to evaluate its appropriateness, so that becomes another line item in the implementation plan.
We don't have the Dr. Cog Urban Center designation in the current implementation plan, right? That was an add-on that we did. So we'd have to add that anyway. So it'd be easy enough to make it all fit together in one package. Or maybe you're right. I guess she's right, isn't she? Dennis? It would have to be two separate items. Apply for it, and then consider applicability or suitability.
Well, I mean, we're suggesting that we have to need to address its appropriateness. So there has to be an action item that takes place in order to address it.
Yeah, and it could all be, I think it could all be the same action probably. So.
Well, right now, the main point is to respond to them, tell them what the limitations are on what we're looking for with the urban center designation, and then work it into the implementation table.
Okay, so we all agreed with that language? Anybody object? You do? Okay. So we all agreed on that. So let's move forward. The next ones I see are 15, 16, and 17, which we addressed. Oh, no, 15 and 16, sorry. And that's the R5. Then number 27 is the height map on page 5.
The most significant comment in that response is the last sentence.
It's a balancing act.
Right. You know, I've said this before. God, I say everything before, don't I? We keep talking about the studies that we did with Dick Farley as being intended to address protection of historic or landmark property. That wasn't what it was for. We did those studies to demonstrate for ourselves the consequences of current zoning requirements, current requirements as far as height limits, density, on-site parking. That's why we did it. The rest of it came in as an afterthought. So let's not lose sight of that. The problem we found was if you keep the height limits, not just on Main Street, which is certainly consistent with everything we've heard from the community, but going beyond that into the almost uniformly CA-zoned areas north and south of Main Street, and you keep in the area to the south of Main Street, you keep the building forms and orientation to the street and to each other, what you're essentially telling developers is, we like development, but we're going to put so many roadblocks and constraints in place that you cannot do financially feasible development in this area. So if we're going to say that, let's just say it. Don't be cutesy and say, we want historic preservation and development when we're going to put so many constraints on development that there will not be any development.
So how would you recommend adding a response?
You know, every now and then, out of these 69 or whatever comments from City Council, we might consider that some of them had merit worth considering. And this might be one of them. I still say, again, what I've always said, when you're standing on the street, a one-story building blocks your view of the view to the mountains. It doesn't matter whether it's 3, 4, or otherwise.
But all they're asking is, what is the
thinking behind it?
Yeah.
Well, what I'm saying is, in my opinion, the thinking was myopic, short-sighted, and was not honestly dealing with the obvious consequences of the height map.
I'm writing it down.
I asked this question, right? This question came up last time. Oh, when Pam said, why didn't we orient height for the mountains? And the response was the study was done to ensure that we can maintain the historic character of the Main Street. So that was the answer that was given to me at that time, of the intent of the height study.
And it was also to maintain, and it was also to maintain the view corridors that exist in the downtown area as much as possible.
So that's our answer then. I mean, yes, does it impact economic development? Yes. But the answer to what was the thinking behind this, it was to maintain the character of of Main Street and the, what'd you say, the views, the corridors?
The view corridors.
So do we add the general idea is to maintain the character of the downtown area while enhancing its vitality and maintaining view corridors?
I think what Dave is suggesting is, contradicts this comment of enhancing its vitality. It is not enhancing its vitality.
It's constraining it.
Should we just delete enhancing?
I think so.
Just say the downtown.
I never heard that was the intent of it.
Were we also trying to limit, though, what can be done in the CA because there's really no height restriction? So one of our goals was there's certainly no height restriction. If someone were to amass a large enough property, they could go as high as they wanted to.
The question we deferred was, other than the Main Street frontage,
There's not,
period.
business in the CA does not have the,
I would qualify that a little bit, exactly. The CA has a 40-foot height limit, but through the PDO process, you can ask for greater heights and it may be approved. And Planning Commission was just saying, let's put some kind of guidelines in terms of what the maximum that would be approved.
Right, and we weren't addressing the CA zoning or the CA zoning provisions. We were talking about
downtown.
This area. Exactly. Whereas, as far as the Main Street frontage and its character and vitality, as far as the setbacks, step-backs to protect the iconic buildings, we were clear on that. But for the rest of it, quibbling over which block, regardless of the current zoning districts or the historic districts, are to be 40 foot, 45 foot, 50 foot is rather ill-founded, because it just doesn't make that much difference.
Steve, then Jenny.
Yeah, towards the beginning of that meeting, Paul Bingham had shown the map of the height limits without the PDOs, and with that is what I think everybody was going off of at the height limit on thinking that we were going exceptionally higher than the height limits, because they didn't have in there the terminology that the PDOs can take that height limit that he had on his map that they were all looking at that concerned them, and take that limit and grow it up substantially higher than that we're looking at.
And, yeah, I think you're exactly right, Stephen. And the other part of that is it's possible that they may not get any approval above the 40 feet. So as they go through the process, they may not be able to justify that they're doing a good enough project or it's appropriate in that location. So, but in those cases where they could go through and did get approval, you're just saying we want to cap it at this just in case. So we don't want to see a 60-foot or 70-foot building.
And cap it up front so everybody knows that they don't have to wait until they come in and then, surprise, surprise, we don't like your project is 55 feet high.
Wait, Jenny?
I guess when I look at the height map, it's showing that there is more of a stepping of the structures, that rather than in this zoning that we've just got a straight 40-foot for CA, that we're acknowledging that there could be some variation stepping away from Main Street and higher towards the railroad tracks and higher towards Arapahoe Community College, higher towards the Lexington development, because those structures are already higher to begin with. So I think we're acknowledging where the direction of where the city is going, but at the same time trying to keep a cap on how far up it's going. That's my interpretation of our height map.
Well, we also have to protect the decision that was made on the Littleton loft, so that that's not going to stick out like a sore thumb.
Too late.
Yeah, well, because they don't have the sunset provision there. So at some point in time, we can very well have a 60-some foot tall building over there, and if we keep the height over there at 35 feet, then that's going to be like a skyscraper.
Our goal was to cap heights that could be extended from the CA's 40 feet to a PDO's unlimited, right? That was the overall goal?
Exactly.
And
At the same time, we wanted to protect the character and appearance of Main Street, and we wanted to provide mechanisms to cushion, frame, buffer, whatever, the historic and landmark buildings. At one point, we talked about looking at setting limits on the differential between existing and new buildings, 2 stories, whatever, shadowing, or a 1-to-1 setback or something like that. Would that not have accomplished what we were trying to do without getting into this pastiche of different height zones superimposed over different zoning districts, superimposed over historic districts, all of which have no consistent effect on view corridors, either within this area or certainly from the area to the east across the tracks?
Well, let me go back to Kurt's statement that the goal is to limit heights where none exist, and see if we want to add that to that draft response. What do you guys think? Everybody want to add
Just a quick
that?
response to what David was saying. I think if we'd started that path, David, we'd have to go block by block, lot by lot.
And we did
decide
that.
whether we're going to go this high or that high, and I think we came up with a reasonable height map that can be used in stepping away from Main Street and setting those, as this area comes down to the south towards the ACC, it drops in elevation anyway, so you can go a little bit higher down there, and we determined that by Lexington it's probably already 50 feet
Okay,
anyway.
all I'm going to ask is that everybody keep in mind what our primary goals with this were, as we just enunciated. Because if the details of this are challenged and persistently challenged by City Council, we could find this whole thing blowing up in our faces, no height map, and then we have not provided for the protections that we were looking for in our early discussion. So
Well,
we
and I-
suddenly are looking at a void.
And I think if we explain that in the presentation tomorrow, we'll be right on target. And you know, we've got this response, and part of the response is to do the presentation. So I kind of want to.
Dave, will you be there tomorrow night? Would you like to talk about the height map and how it's a protection to from unlimited
Trusting
heights?
to my integrity to defend something that I don't have any confidence in? Yeah, you're asking a lot, Steve.
Yeah.
Maybe you are asking a lot. Maybe I should thank you.
So with regard to the language, so we want to delete the down while enhancing its vitality, and then add the goal is to limit heights where none exist. And
To answer Steve's question, if everyone is in general agreement with me about the primary goals, setting the cap so that PDs don't run wild, protecting the Main Street profile, protecting the significant historic and landmark buildings, and then I'll skip the rest of it and just say, and this is a mechanism we thought would serve that end.
That's exactly what that height map is.
And yes, I can say that with a straight face.
You know, that's exactly what the height map is to protect the limits from
But
from what the PDO can make it grow to.
I would, again, caution you to expect challenges from a couple of the council people on whether this, in fact, does what we intend it to do.
And that's,
I won't respond to that, but somebody else needs to be prepared
that's why I
to.
think it's very important that we get the height section done right and done first, because I'm anticipating that we will have changes to the height map. And I think we need to present it really concisely. We've got to say, here's our building, here's our accounting structure, this is what the heights are, here's our zoning map, and here's how it overlays with what we're proposing. Here's our existing conditions here, and this is what we're proposing. So it's taking the existing comp plan and saying, this is how it changes.
With that understanding, yes, I can present it, and yes, I can even defend it and do a reasonably reputable job of doing so, but don't expect me to take it beyond when it gets into how effective that is. Somebody else is going to have to step in on that. And Steve, if I stray from those assurances, do the same thing you were going to do for me as Chair Pro Tem. When I go on too long, throw something at me.
Throw something at you. Dennis? Did you by chance happen to, on number 65, happen to have the information that the mayor was asking for the heights?
Yeah, it's height map.
Oh.
It was the listing of all the iconic buildings and their heights.
Yeah, we don't have all the buildings downtown. We've got the key buildings, that thing we put together, where we went through and identified key buildings. And then we also have the heights on the different streets. So we've got the exactly the height. So I think it's not every building downtown, but it's at least an indication, I think, of what the relevant heights are and how they relate to one another. So.
To give them some feel for the fact that a 50-foot building on a higher street is going to have more impact than a 40-foot building on a lower street.
Exactly. Do we know, or can you provide what we anticipate the Littleton Lofts to be as a height and what the mill is?
Yes.
True height?
Yeah. What we think the height is, Dave has a different sense, and I think he has a great way of measuring it. And so I think we need to bring that in.
Want to meet me out there in the morning, and we'll do it together?
Sure.
Linda, excuse me.
Sorry.
How much longer do you think we're going to be going?
Do you guys want to target 9:30 to finish this up?
Is there any possible way?
We've only got one more to go.
We've got
Oh,
still
and
to
all the
address.
details.
We still got to discuss the framework, and I'd like to touch base on the implementation strategies. And then if you guys have time to read some of these and provide your comments in the wee hours of the morning so that we can incorporate those comments into the document bit. Like specifically, Jenny, there's some comments regarding the parking reduction table. I know that you thought that was pretty important, and any comments you can get.
And again, if you did offer language tonight, or if you're offering language, if we get copies of that too, so we make sure we get that correct.
So is that acceptable?
I'll have to leave in 5 minutes. I'll have to leave a quarter after.
Okay. So we're okay, is everybody okay with the language that we did for the height map on number 27 with the additions? Any objections? None? Okay, so that takes us to the next speed bump.
For framework?
Yeah, framework is
29.
29.
okay. First off, do we have any volunteers to present this framework? Seeing none.
Did we ever get a volunteer to handle the
Who all's
Dr.
going to be
Cog
there
thing?
tomorrow night?
No.
Craig and Jenny won't be there, and Matt won't be there.
Did we ever get a volunteer
Four of
to
us?
front for the Dr. Cog issue?
So,
Not yet.
okay. So 1, 2, 3,
Four of us.
4, 5. 5. Okay.
Oh, you're going to be gone too, Steve?
I'll be there.
Okay.
Good.
So 5 includes.
5 of us. Isn't that funny? And we have 5 issues to address.
Who doesn't have one yet?
I don't, but I honestly just won't have time to address it this evening or even tomorrow. Sorry.
And I can do two. I was hoping that we can give framework to Dave.
Well,
And I could swap for height.
Let's try.
Framework?
Okay.
Dennis, do you want to do framework, or?
Yeah,
I could do framework, sure.
Okay.
I think that would be great.
Okay.
And then that leaves me with Dr. Cog.
I'm going to beg you, drop the snapshot of today as well as a plan for tomorrow. Please,
Where's that? Oh,
under framework.
framework. How about framework, just leaving frameworks have been effective?
Thank you.
Okay. Everybody agree with that language?
Sure.
Okay, so
Just
can we talk quickly about the implementation? Really quickly, I know Peggy made a number of comments on how she wants to change the orientation of the map, and then we wanted to change, that the timeframes were a little too restricting, so Glenn has a proposal to change the duration of the time. Instead of doing the 12 months, 24 months, just change it to priority and do a low, medium, and high, right? Is that right?
That was my idea. Mm-hmm. And basically would utilize your timeframes, ongoing would stay the same, but that would be our low, medium, high.
We wrestled with this a long time ago, talking about priorities. And one of the things we I think, chose to avoid by dropping the idea of prioritization is the implication that one of these is more important than another, and therefore those are the ones you pursue first. That's why we tried to set time limits, saying for this to be effective or an effective part of the plan, we need to get this resolved quickly, or we can take a little more time, or it's ongoing. I'd hate to see us revert to try and say, well, this is a number one priority, and this is because that's not what our thinking was. Our thinking was, how quickly do we need to do this in order to pull the plan together?
But there was so much confusion in terms of the time frame by city council. That's why I was thinking this might be an effective way to ease that confusion.
I would suggest a balance to that. So, you just kind of took two scenarios. So David's saying, how fast can you do it? So then you do the little things first, because those things you could do fast. But then maybe what is really a high priority takes so long, so then you never get to it. So when we try to talk about an implementation plan, we really should be balancing, we should be looking at both priority and effort, and then with that come up with a matrix of what are the things you work on first. So it doesn't mean that the highest priority you work on first. It might mean one item that's a low effort, one item that's a medium. So it's looking at both dynamics to then determine what is our implementation plan. It's not one or the other.
And the other thing it avoids is, even though I believe we have too many items that we rather naively consider ongoing when in fact they aren't ongoing, nevertheless, there are going to be a lot of these items that will be ongoing once they get initiated.
Well, I think those ongoing, and that's my hesitation with the statement of ongoing, as time allows. Does anyone ever have?
Well, a lot of the ongoing just kind of fit into administrative efforts in terms of it's more procedural. It's kind of how we operate. It's not a project-specific item in a lot of cases. So it's just something we continue to do was the intent. Now, there'll be exceptions to that, I'm sure, but that's the general sense that that's something that just is built into the structure. The other idea was that we were going to be looking at these kind of as part of the annual work program. So we'll continue to look at what are the priorities this year. And to some degree, they may change over time because the situation will change. You may want to move, the priority from a moderate to a high, or high to move it down from a high to a moderate, just depending on what the situation is. So you do have some flexibility in that.
And with that, I come back to stating it's important to know level of effort, because as things change, then you need to know what the downstream impacts are. So if something moves up the scale in priority and it's a high effort, then you're foregoing maybe 5 other items. And so that's why, to me, it's important to have that knowledge or that transparency of both aspects, so we know what the implications of that change are.
I think that's a great point. And it seems like there should be some kind of term that we could use in terms of what that is. Because priority does imply that this is the most important thing. I mean, you're right. It may take longer to do. So somehow there should be some kind of a balance between those two.
I think I use this all the time. We organize by priority and we organize by effort, and then as a team, we then say, okay, here are the things we're going to work on first. So it's not about working on things first because they're either fast or because they're high priority. That's what the overall plan then becomes. It's what are some short-term things we can do while still balancing and committing time to the longer term.
Well, I understand the need for flexibility. I do agree that this is a very aggressive time schedule that's in here, but we do list duration. So I'm wondering if, to that point, maybe instead of high and low priority, it's short and long term in duration. I still think there's that added complexity of the level of effort required for each procedure, but I think that's something that staff would have to
maybe
work
it's
through
2
that
columns.
we can't put
I mean,
this part.
Can we not categorize them in 2 columns with priority and time frame, and it's a high priority, 24 months to get it done, or 36 months to get it done.
Yeah.
It's a low priority in 24 months.
Yeah, I mean, effort to me could mean time, right? So, yeah.
So what I'm hearing is add priority and keep the duration. What about clarifying the duration means it's 24 months from the beginning of the program?
Beginning of the plan, but also the low priority 24-month item could become a 48-month item.
Yeah. At the same time, I think we need to admit to ourselves and confess to City Council that what we have on here was a first pass. Thanks, Glenn, for trying. But we need to reevaluate some of this stuff and be a little more cognizant of the issues that council was really addressing. And those were, what kind of staff resources is this going to demand and take away from staff's ongoing responsibilities? Mm-hmm. And what's this going to require demand of City Council? I think actually that was the first issue that came up. Almost everything says this City Council is going to do it. What are you going to expect from us? Well, mostly what we're saying, the only reason City Council is on there is because they're the ones that have to bless it, whatever we do. So it's not like it's putting a lot of time demands on them. I think we need to make that very plain to them up front. But I think the other suggestions about the 2 different columns, urgency versus, or priority versus necessary time frame, are helpful. Quite frankly, if we haven't gotten to it, but we will, I think some of Peggy's suggestions about separating the columns so you can see very clearly staff Planning Commission, et cetera, might also help if we could, that would help anybody looking at it quickly. Unfortunately, I don't see a simple way of differentiating between a procedural action by City Council, as in approving something brought to them, proposed by Planning Commission and brought by staff, and something that's really going to take time.
But one of the things that we were proposing is that when we put this list out on the website, that there'll be flexibility that anybody can change the orientation of this spreadsheet to how they want to use it. And to me, it's a management tool for the Community Development Department, and they can figure out how to format it however works best for them. And it's not up to me to micromanage that.
Well, I don't think we're talking micromanaging. Council has asked us, what kind of demands is this going to make on staff resources and on City Council time in particular? So I'm asking the question, if somebody could come up with a relatively simple way of differentiating between City Council blessing the work done by other groups versus City Council actually having to put the time into it. And really the same for the rest of us. If staff just needs to look something up, not a really burdensome task. If there were some way of doing that, would we be willing to at least address the council that is worth pursuing, and we will try and do that?
I just think there's way too much going on that, I mean, it's one of the more minor, it's not a serious recommendation.
I think you're misreading council. I think there are people in council who see that as a major concern in terms of resources for staff resources and council's time.
You know, I can appreciate that comment, because for them, if they're saying, I'm going to approve this plan, but then I can't execute on it, then what's the value of the plan? So they have to consider that, right?
Yeah, and I don't think we can come up with an instant solution between now and tomorrow morning. But if we at least can agree that, okay, if we put some thought into it, we might be able to do those differentiations still within a table format, so it's easily perceived and easily tracked, it's worth at least telling them we're willing to take that on to try and do that. If we agree that we're willing to take that on and try and do that. But I think it would overcome a lot of their reluctance at what they think this implementation schedule is what burdens do they think this implementation schedule may be imposing on the city as a whole.
Go ahead.
One thing I was going to say is if we had language in here that every year staff and the Planning Commission would actually specifically set timeframes for certain projects or something along that line.
In the work plan.
You know, it's for year to year, we know what's coming up. And
set general targets in here, but it's going to be reevaluated and specifically reviewed for inclusion in the year's work plan.
Right.
Where we identify resources and demands and that sort of
And
thing.
in our draft response, it says pretty much that the Planning Commission will routinely review the implementation strategies and review the plan, and it also justifies why we were going to review it in 10 years as opposed to 5 or 15 or 20.
That kind of elaboration could save us a lot of grief.
And define roles, too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a lot of work that has to be done with the implementation strategies, but I mean, the meat and potatoes of the plans are the goals and policies, and to me, that's kind of important.
The question then becomes, how much of this can we really pull together in time for City Council to be sitting there saying, okay, we are now looking at a final document that we are going to ratify, rather than it's this document plus a bunch of promises for pie in the sky by and by.
To me, City Council is going to they have to vote on a list of changes that they want. And so whatever changes those are, I think they're anticipating that we will automatically accept them.
So we, and I use the term loosely, will have 1 day less than 2 weeks to, not even that, 10 days?
A few hours.
9 days to finalize all that into a form for distribution to council for action?
They will pick and choose from this document what they want, and they'll pick and choose what kind of motions they want to make regarding the plan.
Yeah, but they'll be expecting some kind of a finalized written set of, okay, we're going to change this, we're going to change that before, on the Thursday before, with their packet before that meeting? Okay. they may make more changes, but they're going to want to at least take whatever we talked about last week, whatever we talk about tonight and tomorrow, put it into written form and say, okay, this is what we're now talking about.
And they can't vote on anything tomorrow night, so their votes have to be at the next meeting. So we might not know what they're going to be discussing on the following Tuesday.
But the direction will be clear. I think we'll get 80% of it settled.
Hope for. Yeah.
There'll be last-minute issues that come up or afterthoughts, or somebody decides, on second thought, I don't like that explanation. That's to be expected. But we can get the bulk of it done into a written, what do you want to call it, report to, proposal to council, this document plus previous changes plus the ones we propose tomorrow night.
Very similar to what we presented to you.
Right.
Can I real quickly bring up this other issue since we're running low on time? In this document, there were some things that the city council members mentioned that were editorial and did not change the context of the goals, policies, and procedures. And what I was wondering if we agreed that I used some language in here that says the Planning Commission feels that this, and I lose. Let me see if I can get this language here. Yeah, number 35. I used the language, Planning Commission voted if the editorial changes do not significantly change the context, leave the text as is. I was making assumptions for the Planning Commission, but what do you guys think about that in terms of some of the editorial changes that occurred with some of the goals, policies, and implementation procedures? Or
If the editorial change does not, what editorial change?
right, for example, on number 35, it was suggested to change stable to something like vibrant or healthy, and we had debated that extensively and agreed to use the word stable instead of vibrant or healthy. So, and it doesn't, if we change that context, if we change the word, it would change the context.
Do you mean context or intent there? I don't understand context in that, the way it's used. Planning Commission voted if the editorial change does not significantly change the context.
Or we could say intent, either one of
It
those.
should be the intent, I think.
Yeah. And there were a number of suggestions like that.
So we'd have to take a vote to be able to say that.
I think so, because then I'm being a little presumptuous.
Stable, the fear is that stable could be translated into stagnant. Dynamic could be translated into anything goes. So what do you do in the way of a compromise? We've already used, I said that, didn't I? Yeah. We've already used vibrant, so.
We used
what's wrong
vibrant,
with
we used
dynamic?
healthy. Well, it's not a dynamic, it's stable. She's got a concern about the word stable.
I know what I'm saying. You know, sooner or later, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that we might admit that maybe there is something to some of their comments. And so what I'm saying is, if her concern is that stable could get translated to stagnant, and my concern is that dynamic could be translated into anything goes, what are we really trying to say? We're trying to say it is I know we use the word healthy, nobody likes that word.
I like healthy.
It is a dynamic environment that yet remains consistent or true to the character. I think that doesn't sound a whole lot better, does it? Okay.
See,
But that is
the
what we were
point is,
trying for.
we could argue this forever and ever, and we have. And either we change it or keep it the same. And do we really want to address all the editorial changes? Because we would be here till 3 weeks from now.
Do you really think these are going to go away because we choose not to debate them and discuss changing them now? Because they won't.
Well, they could or they could not. I mean, we're just saying here that, we do think that it's an editorial change that does not significantly change the intent of the goal.
Then call a spade a spade. Don't provide all this flowery language. Just say, look, in our sense, in our intention, stable means a controlled environment that promotes growth.
But David, the point is that there's several of these. It's not specific to this one. That there's
I'm just
there's
saying,
a lot
be
of
prepared when it
wordsmithing.
comes up. They will not let this drop. When it comes back, we have to be able to say something. And this draft
We
response
don't
doesn't
have to say, we don't have to respond to everything. We're just saying, hey, we don't think it changes the context. Let's move forward. You know, we've been addressing this for so long.
And they can spend an hour.
They can debate what they want to do. Yeah.
I think it's a good way to address it.
I think we've hashed every one of these over. We don't have to tonight say that we're going to change this one to that. Then we bring it to them, and another council member says, I don't like that word. Let's use a different word. Let them pick the word. But if we just go over and say we're happy with it, we think it means what we want it to mean, let's move on. Then let them make the decision.
Remembering that when you let somebody else set the grounds for the debate, you've conceded at least half of the chance of
We're not
winning.
talking debate here. We're talking, it's not.
And we're fine with it, and
Yeah.
we're moving forward.
Okay.
If they have a different word, you could get 7 different words because there's 7 council.
So do you guys agree that that language would be appropriate in some of those?
So you really mean to say Planning Commission voted, semicolon, if the editorial comment, is that really what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not quibbling. The punctuation really does change the...
Okay, so should we take a vote?
Should we vote?
We should vote.
And you're going to
Okay.
change the language from context to intent.
Yes.
And change it, yeah, and then add the semicolon. So all those in favor of that? And that is everyone except Dave? Okay. So any other issues that we absolutely have to address tonight? And then if people could look at the draft responses and have some comments and submit them to Dennis as quick as possible, because he's got to get it out in the morning to city council.
At the risk of
And
getting
planning
things
commission.
thrown at me, how about Appendix B? We said 3 weeks ago that, okay, we'll leave Appendix B, or 4 weeks ago, we will leave it in here and ask that staff or somebody go through and look to see if there are any essential goals and policies that really ought to be inserted back in the goals and policies section so that we can then eliminate the rest of this and get rid of the conflict. And somebody said, oh, there isn't going to be any confusion or conflict. Well, there was, from the public and from city council. So I'm going to ask the question. Does anybody have the time to filter out any essential goals or policies from Appendix B so that we can then cut Appendix B loose and stop pretending that it is anything other than it is, which is confusing?
I would expect city council is going to make motion to delete some of the sections of the comp plan. And I don't know if Appendix B will be one of them, but I'm concerned about tonight or voting to delete it if we haven't done the due diligence to make sure that everything in Appendix B is in the goals, policies, and implementation strategies.
So we'll let the urgencies of time drive us to just gloss over issues that we identified in the past and said we would resolve, and we haven't resolved them. I find that imprudent at best, irresponsible at worst.
But our vote was to delete, we actually voted to delete it if we did the due diligence.
I'm not going to go back and tell you what we said at the time of the vote. As with most motions, the motion gets made, it gets discussed and manipulated, then it gets restated, and then it gets recorded. And usually the nuance of difference between the three can be substantial. In this particular case, my understanding was we said, unless there is something essential in the way of goals and policies that should be inserted in the goals and policy section, we don't need Appendix B.
Well, what we can do is we could probably review it sometime this week, and then based on the motion that we had, as per staff recommendation, they can just delete it if they wanted to, if they feel comfortable that everything's in there that we need to. And then we can mention it to city council, and they can take action on it in the following week.
I've done my best. I'll be quiet.
I mean, Is there anything else that we need to discuss for tomorrow's meeting? It's going to be a lot in a little bit of time.
Is the discussion limited to those 5 topics, or can it go off in any direction?
I think it'll go off in any direction. I think the big one is to make sure we address these 5. You know, and that we actually have a substantial discussion on it.
I don't think even the mayor would try to enforce we're limited to these 5 topics on the other 6 members of council, especially since the mayor won't be here 3 weeks from now.
And I would also anticipate that the parking reduction table might come up too. So,
And just on the parking reduction table, really the idea is that to acknowledge that downtown is unique and different than other parts of the city, and that we have other modes of transportation such as light rail, bus. It's very walkable, pedestrian friendly, so that residents who live close can bike and walk. So not everyone has to drive to downtown Littleton like they would in other areas of the city, and yet we have the same parking requirements imposed on other areas of the city and downtown. And so really we want to have some kind of mechanism, whether it's the parking reduction table, but a mechanism to be able to differentiate between downtown and other areas of the city. And there's indefinite site constraints that we are working with in downtown.
Okay. I'll make sure that gets updated in the spreadsheet. Any other?
I think that may have been misinterpreted in the council concerns, is that the list of items weren't being recommended there so much as they were identified as tools that can be used in a master plan. So we're not saying this has to be done, but this is one of the things that can be done and has been done.
And the issue remains the same, that we still need to address and reflect the parking requirements in downtown versus other areas of the city.
I'm going to want to add one afterthought for all of us to keep in mind, because sooner or later it's going to flavor what we hear back from council. Unless you've gone back and reread the central area section of the existing comp plan and the community-wide section of comp plan, I don't think very many people out of 42,000 and some odd are aware of how much continuity there is between the current 1981 approved comp plan with its 6 revisions and what we're producing. So our failure to make those connections, to show the foundation for what we're doing, has fed a lot of the opposition from comments saying that, oh, we've never had a general plan, and oh, we haven't done any planning. I think to have allowed people to think that we're pulling this out of the clear blue sky with no foundation, with no precedent, with no continuity, did a major disservice to what we were proposing here. So as the questions come up, remind yourself, there is a lot of connection between what was in the original comp plan and what we're proposing.
Well, and I think that might be one of the questions they ask us tomorrow. What's the difference between the original central area plan and the new central area plan? And we should be prepared to address that. So anything else, Dennis, Glenn?
No, just if you do have any kind of written version of what you put forward tonight, I'd appreciate that.
All right, so do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do we have a second? All those in favor? That is unanimous.
We take a formal vote.
Thank you very much. And let me know if you've got any changes, or let Dennis know.
Dennis, I promised Steve a copy of this. Is there any way you could copy that or send it to him? Or